Greetings from the cosmic horror. The stars are right once again, and the great old ones allow us to talk about for 30 plus minutes H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer who is a genre unto himself. I'm your cosmic host, Mark Griffin, executor of the Lovecraft estate on Yawguff, joined in by two from the material world, David Guffey, a professor at Miss Potomac University, and Richard Wilson, who is running for Judge Priest's old office. Today, our guests are Todd Haddon, formerly of WKMS Public Radio, and now with Omaha Public Radio. He is director of an audio documentary, Irvin S. Cobb Back Home. And also with us is Nathan Blake Lynn of McCracken County Public Library, Department of Family and Local History. They are here to talk about Kentucky writer Irvin Shrewsbury Cobb. Before we start with our guests, Dave and Richard, how familiar were you two with Irvin S. Cobb?
I'm more familiar with the Irvin Cobb Marina and Resorts. I grew up in Murray, Kentucky, so that was an area we frequented out on the Kentucky Lake a lot. And the significance of the name of Irvin Cobb, what he had done, that type of thing, kind of came later. Versus when I think about that, first thing I think of is more the marina, the resort, as opposed to the man himself.
And you, David?
I did not know anything about him.
Okay. All right. So, Todd, tell me, who was Irvin S. Cobb?
Irvin S. Cobb was a Paducah native journalist, writer, trailblazing war correspondent, one of the most highly paid authors of his age. He was good friends with just about anybody that was good to know in the early 20th century. Will Rogers, John Ford. He even did a handful of movies, one of which was Steamboat Round the Bend, probably one of the most notable one that he was in, directed by John Ford and co-starring his friend Will Rogers. He was also the author of a series of short stories and longer works about a fictionalized version of an old Paducah judge, the fictionalized name being Judge Priest, and was kind of inadvertently influential on American horror literature, I should say.
And he was very popular.
Oh, yes. It used to be that when people would get together in barbershops, back when that was a thing, there would be arguments that would break out over who was funnier, Will Rogers or Irvin Cobb. And the funny thing is that both of them would have pointed at each other.
And he also had like his own cigarette brand. He had a train and a bridge named in honor of him. Mm-hmm. And Paducah has a hotel named in honor of him. And at one time, there was even a golf tournament in Paducah named after him. Mm-hmm. So he was quite big.
Nathan, he was very much the part of the warp and woof of the town.
Yeah. Nathan, how did you first hear about Irvin S. Cobb?
I mean, I grew up in Paducah, so his name was on everything. And it was just part of our culture, I guess, his writings and his more his name, though. I think there's something to be said about that. If you grew up at a certain time, I was born in 1980, so Cobb was more of a landmark type piece with the Irvin Cobb Bridge or the resort or the Irvin Cobb Hotel, which is still standing and beautiful. So yeah, that was my first introduction to him, I guess. And then slowly I started reading his material and have tried to stay up on it. Todd is much more of a scholar than I am, probably in the ways of Cobb, but
I wish.
A very interesting man, and lived a very interesting life.
Now, what did you first read by him?
The first thing that I read by him that I recall was Back Home, a collection of short stories. And Cobb was definitely the short story writer. That was his thing. He never really had a definitive novel that set him up with a lot of other people in American literature, but he was a very great short story writer, and that worked well for him in his time period, writing for the publications that he did. But Back Home was a collection of short stories. He has a number of those books that are collections of his short stories, and I, coming from a history and folklore background of Western Kentucky, I was very interested in his writings because he often uses real places and people and events that happened when he was younger to describe things and tell his stories. So there, you can learn a lot about our area from reading his material.
This will go to both of y'all. So when y'all read his works, did y'all pick up, like, things he'd mentioned, go like, oh, I know where that is, or, like, I've been there, or, stuff like that?
Oh, definitely. Like with, he had a short story called Fish Head, and that is set in and around Reelfoot Lake. And if you know anything about the area, you know that Reelfoot Lake was created by the New Madrid earthquakes of around 1812. And that it is a very unique place that is just like it was dropped right smack dab in the middle of West Tennessee. And it is still a lot like that to this day, even right down to the way he describes it as being a very swampy place. But that was probably that, along with the fact that you saw his name everywhere and, drove past his gravesite every time we would come back from downtown. Yeah, I mean, it really was easy to kind of plug into Irvin Cobb.
And now he started off as a reporter for the Paducah Evening Sun, and then later went on to the Louisville Evening Post, and he covered the assassination of William Goebel, and I'm assuming that's where he got his first prominence, covering the assassination.
Well, it was kind of a series of steps, actually. I mean, he would just happen to be in the right place at the right time when an escaped convict from Chicago resurfaced in Fulton, Kentucky, and just happened to be right there. And the police were kind of blocking everybody out, except for the jail guard who fought in the Civil War with Cobb's uncle, I believe, and so let the young Cobb in to interview him. And he started getting more attention. In fact, that's how he got the Louisville job. And from there, he just, again, happened to be in the right place at the right time for the assassination of William Goebel. Even right down to being in a very good position to dispute William Goebel's official last words, which were far and away more eloquent than they probably would have been for a man in his position. According to Cobb, Goebel's last words were, "Doc, that's a damn bad oyster," because he had asked for oysters, and the doctor was like, "He's dying, give it to him." And apparently didn't care for him, which is a hell of a point to make when you are on your deathbed. But it wasn't really probably until he went to New York and got to cover the Portsmouth Peace Conference, which ended the Russo-Japanese War and got Theodore Roosevelt his Nobel Peace Prize. And because of the way that was set up, the reporters couldn't get to the delegates. So there was really no one to interview. And so Cobb basically filled his column inches with very elaborate and in-depth descriptions of the people that he saw. I mean, you have Portsmouth in walks the Japanese, in walk the Russians. And that really brought him to a greater level of prominence because he kind of took a very almost a magazine writer approach to a current event. He couldn't write about anything else, so he went with what he literally could see.
It reminds me a little bit, almost like a prototype version of Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah, another great Kentucky writer.
Yeah.
That really kind of picked up. I actually would probably myself compare him more to Michael Hare, who was a correspondent during the Vietnam War, and collected his pieces into a collection called Dispatches, which if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. But Cobb was on the Western Front of the First World War and was there for, I believe, the Saturday Evening Post. And this is before the United States entered the war. So he was able to cross from the Allied lines into the German lines and report from both sides. His pieces were collected into a book called Paths of Glory, which is a really compelling read, particularly if you're used to any of his fiction, where he can be very loquacious. But on the other hand, Paths of Glory, it's very evocative but it's so much more succinct than his fiction is. It's really quite powerful. And it was almost as if he was really widely feted as a war correspondent. In fact, there was a piece of music called The War Correspondent that was written for him in the late teens. In a way, he kind of is the prototypical Ernie Pyle, the prototypical Michael Herr. Anybody that writes from a war zone, he kind of laid out he blazed the trail, so to speak.
He gave a spotlight to the Harlem Hellfighters.
Yes.
As well.
Oh, yes.
And I haven't read that one. How was that book?
Well, it's contained in, I believe, Paths of Glory. I think it's toward the back end of the book. I'm trying very hard to remember. I've slept since the last time I've read it, but and it was really quite remarkable because Irvin Cobb has something of a complicated history with race relations, but his portrait of the Harlem Hellfighters was not patronizing. It was admiring without being, devolving into like some sort of hagiography of all these men who fought. It really quite remarkable, and it's unusual to see, given how difficult it can be to unpack Cobb's racial politics.
And we'll discuss that later. And but I was
That's deep water.
Yeah. He also, when he was writing newspaper columns, he also started writing kind of his fiction and started developing his style as a humorist as well, from what I understand.
Well, having read Cobb and listened to him give speeches and do interviews and movies and programs, I can tell you that they always say that a writer should write almost as he speaks, and Cobb certainly did that. Cobb was not a man of few words. He was a man of dictionaries. He really and truly was.
You can see that in his early journalism writing. Very, very descriptive events that he had to report on. So
he got paid by the column inch.
Yeah, and so rightfully so. But he was a storyteller, and I think he got that honestly from the people he grew up around, and he talks about that, listening to whether it be Civil War veterans or to people that he was around that told larger than life stories. And so I think he got that naturally, and maybe his time as a journalist gave him the space to use as many words. But he was definitely, that larger in life guy. I know I've said that, but he drank, he smoked cigars, he liked to hang out and talk, and that made him collect more stories. So yeah.
Okay. And then he started writing his Judge Priest stories, which started making him very popular. And I guess his first one was Words and Music. And so what are y'all's views on that? On Judge
I'm
Priest?
not sure of his first Judge Priest story, but William Bishop was a larger than life character, and Cobb took elements of, I think, numerous people and gave those to old Judge Priest. And I don't know how many short stories he wrote or stories that he wrote about old Judge Priest, but most of those stories take place in Paducah. They tell a story of Western Kentucky. There's one that takes place not far from my home here at Maxon Mills, where they go to a political gathering to speak, I think, and there's burgoo served. And so with his Judge Priest stories, I think it really let him delve into maybe loosely based historical fiction, I guess you could say. I'm not sure if you could use that there, but he definitely was taking true stories and adding what he wanted to those. Todd, would you agree?
Oh yeah. I mean, he was very definitely, it was almost as if, to an extent, he was retelling the folk tales, but he was also kind of, I think, trying to raise the image that people had of the South. Because without a doubt, he is very much a Southern writer. I mean, when you consider that, Judge Priest himself is a Confederate veteran. They talk about fighting in the 3rd Kentucky, which was raised largely in Western Kentucky, and participated in the Battle of Shiloh, was even involved in the Vicksburg campaign. And he had family that fought in the war. I mean, he was very much rooted in it. I mean, he got a radio program in the late 30s called Paducah Plantation. And having listened to at least one episode of it several times, that's another story. I can tell you, I mean, he's very much of the Moonlight and Magnolia school. I would almost say, speaking from a historical perspective, I would almost say that he was not an advocate of the lost cause, but I don't think he minded it too much. That said, again, it all goes back into a very complicated outlook about race and about politics and about his home. But he was very much a Paducan. I mean, there is no, like Mark Twain, who was buried in Connecticut, even though he grew up in Missouri. There was no doubt that Irvin Cobb, once he passed away, was wherever he was going to be brought back to Paducah, and he was. So I mean, yeah, very much of his place, and almost an advocate for it in a lot of ways. Very proud Kentuckian, very proud Paducan, very proud bourbon drinker. I mean, he almost leaned into some of the stereotypes that one would have in defense of the South.
Now, did Cobb ever call his town Paducah in the Judge Priest stories?
I don't remember. Nathan, do you?
I don't know either, but I can tell you that a lot of them take place here, whether he did or not. And I do know that he uses multiple places and street names, and talks about the 3rd Kentucky a lot. But that's a great question.
I did a search through his stories and never could find Paducah mentioned. I know.
Yeah, he might not have ever used the word. He might have left that out to try to reach a broader audience, maybe.
I know on the film adaptations, it was called Fairville.
Yeah, there's two film adaptations of that. One with Will Rogers, and I can't think of the lead in the other one that was made in the 50s.
I don't get that name. I have him.
But both of those are very interesting. As much as I think Cobb wanted Will Rogers, and they were good friends, and to play that character, to me, the second film, honestly, stands out better. And I'm a huge Will Rogers fan. I love Will Rogers. I just thought that the second film was a little better. Fight me.
It's Charles Winninger.
That's correct.
But I do think the second one was probably more faithful to his books, as opposed to the first one was just kind of more of a Will Rogers movie.
Yep. He had very outsized personality. So he did have a tendency to kind of take scripts and kind of run with them. I mean, when they shot Steamboat Around the Bend, the two of them, Cobb and Rogers, drove John Ford crazy because they would just start ad-libbing and improving entire scenes. So some of it made it into the film. A lot of it didn't, probably because it had John Ford swearing a lot. I mean, there's really no way to tell. But so if Will Rogers, the first one may not be the most faithful adaptation, but I don't think you'd ever hear Cobb say a bad word against it.
I think is that right? John Ford remade it because he wanted to be like a little bit more, because he felt that Will Rogers kind of like overtook the movie.
That wouldn't surprise me. Knowing the kind of filmmaker that John Ford was, that would not surprise me at all.
Reading some stories, I was a little bit I was a little bit interested in certain things. It was like, was there actually a house of prostitution in Paducah?
Well, yeah. In fact, we have an art house cinema. I say we, and even though I'm in Omaha, there's an art house cinema in Paducah called Maiden Alley. And it is called that because it is on the alley where if you were coming off of a steamboat in the 1870s, 1880s, and you wanted company, that's where you went.
Wow.
So yes, we had one. And in fact, the community theater in Paducah, Market House, one of the buildings that faces it has very narrow windows. And those narrow windows are narrow because there were several rooms that lined that part of the hallway, and they were narrow. There was enough room in there for a bed and a nightstand. And that is where you would take your, company for the evening and enjoy a pleasant hour or two.
Well, there's some
And the windows are still there.
And also the mob from Massac, I guess how you say that area. Massac. Was that inspired by the lynching of Charles Hill and also the following race riot that happened in 1892?
I don't have any information on that, but I can tell you right now, if it was, that would not surprise me at all.
There are certain parallels between them. And it seems almost like Irvin S. Cobb wrote it as a way to have more of a happy ending than actually the events.
That would not surprise me either. I mean, this was a guy that when the Ku Klux Klan tried to make inroads into Paducah, Cobb was, a writer of national prominence and came back and edited the Paducah Sun Democrat for an entire day and wrote strongly against the Ku Klux Klan, and it was to a great degree. And you might want to double check me, Nathan, but I mean, I'm pretty sure he was to a great degree responsible for the Klan not making that big of an inroad into the town.
Yeah. In terms of that story, Cobb also covered or was aware of another lynching by a man named George Devil Winston, who Cobb had supposedly delivered ice with on a ice wagon when he was a child. And there's a folk song written about this event. So a horrible thing that Cobb probably lived through numerous times, and I'm not sure the inspiration for that story, but Massac is a term used to describe numerous places here in Western Kentucky and Southern Illinois. You have Fort Massac. Across the river from Fort Massac in Southern Illinois, you have Massac Creek, which runs all through McCracken and Ballard over to Graves County. And so there is a place here in Western Kentucky called Massac too, out close to Paducah. So he could have got that name from numerous places.
There was a article I came across. It was called "All Code is Local" by Richmond Adams. Are y'all familiar with that article? Basically, he's kind of his critique of the mob story, and he pointed out that priests had served under Nathan Bedford Forrest, and it was one of the most infamous incidents happened in Forrest was the Fort Pillow massacre, where the black soldiers were executed rather than captured like the white soldiers. And Priest never spoke directly of the incident, but Adams contends readers would be well aware of the event. And so in Words of Music, he recollects serving in Forrest's army. We'd gone anywhere or tried to behind Old Bay for Forrest. And so when Priest confronted the mob, the readers would be thinking of the Fort Pillow massacre as well. And so I was wondering what y'all's thoughts on that.
That's a little off, and I'll tell you why. After Forrest attacked Paducah in 1864, March of 1864, and before he headed south toward Fort Pillow, he furloughed all of his Kentucky troops because his Kentucky contingent largely came from Western Kentucky. So he basically let them go home. And I do not know, because I mean, I kind of fell into that same trap myself, looking at the Fort Pillow massacre, that the Fort Pillow massacre was quite possibly a consequence of the Battle of Paducah, but there were few, if any, Kentucky troops involved in that. And of course, it doesn't necessarily absolve anybody of any kind of association or blame, but that's something that people who were from the area would have known. On the other hand, I'm not sure that when Cobb wrote that he would have necessarily made that distinction. But I can't imagine that, because I almost made the same mistake that the article's author did of assuming that the 3rd Kentucky, which was assigned to Forrest in late 63, early 64, was there, when in fact they were not. And I mean, the reason primarily is I had 3 family members that were in the 3rd Kentucky. And so I kind of wanted to figure out if they were involved in the Fort Pillow massacre, because make no mistake, that's what it was. And even if it is, as some Forrest defenders say, that Forrest lost control of his troops during that engagement, he's the commanding officer. He is still responsible for the action of his troops and his failure to maintain military discipline. So, but then again, it's the South. You're not going to have those kind of negative connotations. And frankly, in many places in the South, you still do not have negative connotations associated with Nathan Bedford Forrest, in spite of it all. So I think, just from the historical record, it would be something I feel kind of obligated to point out. But on the other hand, I don't know that Cobb, writing in that context, would have made that, or would have bothered to make that distinction, given that Forrest had that kind of cultural cachet in the region.
Okay. Got any input, Nathan?
No, in fact, Forrest might have, Cobb might have played off that. I think Todd's right. He probably did not care one way or the other, but he thought it was great for his story. And you can find that in numerous instances of Cobb's writing. At the McCracken County Public Library, we house a pretty large collection of Cobb's research and notes and letters and work. And there's another local author named Fred Newman who wrote for the Paducah Sun, Democrat, and wrote numerous books. He wrote one book called The Story of Paducah. And I bring this up because in Cobb's and Newman's collection, both, you can read their letters back and forth to each other. Newman really looked up to Cobb, and Cobb respected Newman. And so Newman was writing Cobb, asking for information about Paducah for his Story of Paducah. And you can find Cobb exaggerating numerous things in these letters back to Newman, which sometimes were included in Newman's Story of Paducah, which can cause problems when people are doing factual historical research.
Just a few problems, just a few.
Like the meeting of Chief Paducah, or
yep.
so on and so on. So going back to the question, I think Cobb was taking whatever he could find and really using it to tell whatever story he had in the back of his mind. And if he could play on things that would trigger some sort of emotion in his readers, I think he was really keen on writing that as well. And it really makes you wonder Cobb's true feelings in terms of numerous things. And it leaves me wondering on how he really felt about certain things in life.
What do you mean exactly? You saying like was he hiding his stuff or hiding his feelings, or?
No, in terms of numerous types of issues, Cobb would often write one way, but you might not know if that was his actual belief or if he was just writing that to tell the story. And I think that is an ongoing thing in any sort of art form, and drawing between the artist and the art, which is an ongoing conversation.
And I'm jumping to Steamboat Round the Bend. That was, I guess he had a pretty I wouldn't call it a cameo in it. He had a pretty good appearance in that movie as Captain Eli. And I noted that the name of the steamboat was the Pride of Paducah, and that Rogers' vessel was called the Claremont Queen, which was the name of his estate that he, or his ranch he had in Oklahoma. And so I kind of wonder if there's like some type of thinly veiled, metaphor for viewers, kind of, which is a better humorist, Will Rogers or Irvin Cobb, since they have the race, against each other.
That dynamic, those two guys, I think that they made each other laugh. So, there may have been kind of a one-upsmanship, but it was incredibly good-natured, probably that it had any more right to be. But yeah, I could see that very easily as some sort of metaphorical back and forth between the two, because they would do that. They would have that kind of they would have those kind of conversations in real life, but it was all done like two friends who tease each other. As vicious as it can be, at the end of the day, there's still friends still just teasing each other. So I don't know that it was, it may not have been any deeper than that.
Well, and I noticed I'm sorry, Nathan.
This brings up interesting point that both Cobb historian Bill Ellis and Todd have talked about, and that is that Cobb wasn't an actor per se. He was a writer, and he saw himself, many believe, being left behind and was pushed to move to California and start being involved in cinema. And so that was not his first thing. So to see him act in Steamboat Round the Bend is it's comical to think about where he was coming from that. If he, in the back of his mind, he's like, what am I doing here? I'm a writer. Why am I doing this? But at the same time, he hams it up and does a decent job. He's going up against Will Rogers, so that's pretty tough for the time period.
He doesn't have a face. I was calling like, Hollywood good looks and all that, but that he definitely was a good character actor. And he seems to have played up on that, making fun of his, being overweight and stuff like that.
Well, I'm sure shooting Steamboat was made easier by the fact that, in a lot of those instances where it's, those back and forths with Will Rogers, I don't know that was anything necessarily unique. If you knew them, if you hung out with them, this might have been just like, this is just what they do on Thursdays, and I would almost argue that, having seen a couple of his other movies, one was a comedy short. The other one was parts of a movie called Pepper that he was in, and he's not that good of an actor. I would say that Steamboat Round the Bend was probably the best performance you were ever going to get out of Irvin Cobb, and that was largely because his role was essentially reacting and antagonizing Will Rogers, which, like I said, was probably what he did every Thursday night.
Okay. And Will Rogers died before the movie was released, and it made me think of one of Cobb's stories, Mr. Lobo's epilepsy, in which the actress in the story, and that story died. And the film crew was debating what to do with the film, whether to destroy it or not. And I see in that movie, they decided not to destroy that, at least in the Rogers movie.
Well, I think we're lucky that I don't think that Cobb would have wanted it to not be released. I think he definitely wanted it to be released, even as much as Will Rogers' death just crushed him. It absolutely crushed him. He wrote very movingly of his friend, and you could almost kind of see a bit of a change in Cobb after Rogers' death. It's almost as if the only person he ever felt like got him was gone. And you lose someone like that in your life, and it's going to make an impact. And I think that it very much was apparent in Cobb. He started speaking. He started increasing his political activism even as much as he already was, campaigned against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. He stumped for Wendell Willkie during that race, and lent his talents to the Republicans. And this is a guy who is as dyed-in-the-wool Democrat as you could get in Western Kentucky in the early 20th century. And I don't know that he would have done that necessarily if Will Rogers had still been around.
We'll jump to his darker tales and kind of more relation to our podcast. This is where Lovecraft comes in, who greatly admired Fishhead. So how would you describe Fishhead to somebody?
That's a really good question. Feel free to jump in, Nathan, anytime. He called them, Fishhead and stories like that, his grim tales. And it almost as if you strip, like with Fishhead, you can strip it all the way down to its barest plot points, and it's very much a kind of a supernatural revenge tale. But on the other hand, it's so atmospheric, and it leans into describing Fishhead himself as something as almost other than human, even though Cobb never really comes out and says it. And I think that setting that almost oppressive atmosphere of what it's like to be in Reelfoot Lake, that's probably what attracted Lovecraft, and made enough of an impact on him that he included it in his essay, The Supernatural in Literature, if I'm remembering that title right. And the impact of that story probably far outstripped anything that Cobb may have put into it. But even then, it's almost as if these grim tales, Fishhead being probably the best exemplar, he poured so much into what were basically very simple stories that were so, you read Fishhead and you can almost smell the muck, and you can almost feel the humidity on your skin. It's almost hard to describe it to someone who may not have read it, but I mean, a very simple story, incredibly evocatively told, which you probably could boil a lot of Cobb down to that. There's a distinct kind of regionalism, and Cobb's command of language is able to just kind of create this bubble for the story to exist in, and you feel everything you need to feel. I'd probably go on for another half hour just talking about that.
I do feel he did a good job of covering, conveying what Reelfoot Lake feels like, because having visited there and then like reading it, you're like going, yeah, he got it right.
Hot, sticky, wet, a lot of mosquitoes. Yeah, he nailed it.
Now, was it based on any like folklore about Reelfoot Lake, or did you just make it all up whole cloth?
I don't know of any folklore connection there. I probably would look more for its inspirations in things that Cobb himself read. And interestingly enough, and now that I think about it, it never occurred to ever really dig into, was there any kind of cross-pollinization going on between Cobb and Lovecraft? I would almost be intrigued to find out. Maybe I don't know, maybe I will actually now that I think about it. Because it's interesting to think of Fishhead in the Cthulhu mythos, for one thing. And to see the impact that it's a fairly limited range of authors that Lovecraft includes in that essay. And it's intriguing. On the one hand, it's not surprising, but it is kind of intriguing that he includes Cobb and his simple story, that it's very evocatively told.
Yeah, he was a fan of that story, at least from 1913, when it appeared in the Cavalier magazine. He wrote the editor approving of it. And it was one of his first examples of writing, that he did outside of, of his own home.
That's now that you point that out, there's a lot of similarities between the way that Cobb wrote and the way that Lovecraft wrote. But the interesting thing is that, you know, and whereas Cobb is describing things that are a bit more concrete, you know, Lovecraft is coming at this from, you know, this kind of abstract notion of kind of almost incomprehensible horror, and it still manages to kind of, like Cobb, create an atmosphere for it. I mean, I keep thinking of like the Statement of Randolph Carter is a really good example of that. It's one of my favorite of Lovecraft short stories, simply because of the last line. But how he kind of relies on just setting this horrifying scene, because you don't see what happens to his friend who's going down there through the tunnels and caves, except to hear what his friend describes. And the rest of it is just this kind of observing and reacting to the environment that he's sitting in, listening to his friend go through it, and this kind of gnawing tension, because you're just waiting for something to jump out at him or his friend, or, you know, something along those lines. And to end it the way he does, it's really quite amazing. But, you know, it's that slight twist ending that, again, you do find in Cobb's grim stories just as much as you find anywhere else. So I would be very interested to ever find out what Cobb thought of Lovecraft, because there's a very obvious influence, to me at least, in Lovecraft from Cobb.
I know that a copy of the essay, they were trying to find Cobb's address so they could send a copy of the essay to him.
Mhm.
I don't know if he ever got it, you know, or ever read it or anything like that, but it would be interesting to know, you know, if you'd be any opinion of Lovecraft whatsoever.
I would have to, that would basically be sitting down and going through his papers to see if he ever said anything to anybody. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a very intriguing idea. Particularly since I don't really ever get the sense, though, that he commented about other writers so much as he seemed to be commented about by other writers. I mean, Cobb is mentioned in F. Scott Fitzgerald's first novel, not in a positive light. I mean, he compares his characters in the novel look down their noses at people like Cobb, or I think Mary Richards Reinhardt, who wrote The Bat, the mystery novel The Bat. They kind of look down on what they see as very kind of simplistic storytelling, or I would say simple storytelling, as opposed to the stuff that, you know, obviously F. Scott Fitzgerald was doing.
I think that what you just said is very telling about the story of Fishhead, is the simplicity of it. It's very short, it's very descriptive. It gets the point across, though, of what happened. And maybe there was some truth in their analysis, but I don't think that they were probably coming at it from a different view. I think sometimes simple is more pungent.
You know, as popular as Cobb was during his lifetime, you know, it's Fishhead where he's like known for today. You know, it's like, and so, you know, in fact, if it wasn't for Fishhead, he probably would be completely forgotten.
You know, that's interesting, because I mean, he died in 1944, and people were still considering him 15 years later. I mean, there was a series of radio plays that were basically half-hour biographies of prominent Americans. I believe it was on either CBS Radio or Mutual, and they did an episode on Irvin Cobb. And the man who wrote the script for that, appropriately enough, was Rod Serling. And when you consider Serling's career in the 1960s and 70s, up until his death, it's almost appropriate that he would write the script for a biography of a man who's most noted now for his grim tales than he is for anything else. Although I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't mention that Cobb would probably not be crazy about that idea of being known for just the weird little stories that he wrote. He would probably want to be more remembered for his dispatches from the First World War, or his commentaries on healthcare and things like that than he would be for those stories, even though those stories are really good.
And there was another story that Lovecraft liked of his, The Unbroken Chain. Even though he didn't recall the title, he did mention in his essay. But I find it an odd one because it's supposed to inspire rats in the wall. And, if you read them and read Rats in the Wall, you're just kind of like going, I don't see it.
That I get the feeling that was more of an overall tone than anything else. That there's this response that Lovecraft had to The Unbroken Chain, and Rats in the Walls was his attempt to kind of recreate it in a sense. Because you're right, they're not very similar, but Lovecraft was a bit of a magpie in that regard. I mean, he has a very distinct voice, but it's a voice that is built of a lot of really almost disparate sources. I mean, you can see the influence of things like the King James Bible or the King in Yellow and stories like that, that he aggregated in that way. So I kind of think it was more of a kind of a tonal response more than anything else.
I did also feel that it seemed like that Lovecraft kind of picked up on some like kind of the more racist elements of Cobb, because sometimes he used like almost like the exact same words, like Nordic,
Yeah.
of his.
Well, I don't know that Lovecraft needed that much help from Cobb, to be honest. I think though that, and I would almost say that I don't know that Cobb would have necessarily agreed with the way Lovecraft characterized ethnic groups, but I could see Lovecraft reading that into Cobb. I mean, that's the funny thing. I mean, Cobb's kind of racial politics are not unsurprising given the time he came from, being born in the 1870s, in the South, in a segregated South. But on the other hand, it was not, I would not consider Cobb to be a racist in broad strokes, but he did have a very almost stereotypically Southern paternalistic attitude toward African Americans. You look at the way that he characterizes Jeff Poindexter in the Judge Priest stories. Even though he does kind of allow Poindexter room to grow and become his own person, but there's still, at least from my reaction to those stories, there's almost a kind of Cobb patting Jeff Poindexter on the head as a character. You did good, so I mean, and like I said, he was responsible for keeping, to a great degree, responsible for keeping the Klan out of Paducah. When he passed away, there was an entire African American choir that sang at his funeral in Oak Grove Cemetery. He had, and I don't doubt that he had real, honest to goodness friendships with African Americans. That said, he is still very much a product of his time, albeit a comparatively enlightened one. I don't know that he would have, if I'll put it this way, if Jim Crow bothered him, it didn't seem like it bothered him that much. But on the other hand, I don't think he really approved of kind of that punching down part of it.
There was a one sentence that he had in his when he denounced the Klan. It was like, I believe in all my heart in white supremacy. I do not believe in a campaign of terror and violence aimed against black men. If a Negro disobeys the law or willfully disregards the law itself, it's for his punishment. Yeah. So it seems that that he didn't care for the Klan, but at the same time he thought that I guess blacks should have their place.
And I think that's an important thing to point out, that he certainly did not think that he certainly thought that blacks had their place. That said, I don't think he had a bad relationship with individuals. But if he lenses out his view on that, yeah, I mean, you could call it white supremacist very easily. I mean, he himself calls it white supremacist. And, you know, that's the thing you kind of have to wrestle with, much in the same way as you have to wrestle with that dimension of Lovecraft's work. As remarkable as it is, there's still a toxic quality to it. I mean, what was the name of that cat again? So there you are. And I don't know that Cobb ever went to those extremes, but then again, it would have kind of just been disruptive to that southernness of his work. Well-bred people just don't talk like that, you know?
It made me think of there was someone who criticized one of his movies. It was the sun shines bright.
Mhm.
And I thought it was interesting, the criticism against it. There was a woman who identified herself as the daughter of a Southerner. She wrote to Will Rogers to complain about the Judge Priest movie, and she complained about the portrayal of blacks in the movie, but it's not the way you think. She stated that Negroes in the South know they keep their place, being respectful and obedient, never appearing in public except in caps and apron. And I guess as she complained about the Stephen Fetch, portrayal of Poindexter, being wearing rags and kind of smarting off and stuff like that. And so I thought it was interesting that that she regarded that as being kind of being a very unflattering portrayal, of the South.
Stephen Fetchit could not catch a break. He was getting it from one end or the other. That for the purposes of the documentary that I produced, I did not dig as deeply into Cobb's relationship with Stephen Fetchit as much as I in retrospect, I would have liked. I just, I get the feeling that Cobb would probably not have really dealt with him at all, to be honest. But I don't think that Cobb, being who he was and where he was from, I suppose he needed a kind of Brer Rabbit character. And Stephen Fetchit, Jeff Poindexter is that character. There are times when Judge Priest himself is that character, but it's mainly Jeff Poindexter. And I think he had an affection for the character.
Didn't you write a novel just of him?
Yeah. A real, honest to goodness affection for him. But on the other hand, he is very much almost I get the feeling that at some point that in writing Jeff Poindexter, Cobb almost forgot he was black in a way, treating him as the protagonist of the novel. But you can draw parallels to Candide and Voltaire and Candide. You can draw parallels to the Brer Rabbit, the Just So stories. And I think that Cobb was kind of picking out an archetype, and Jeff Poindexter, being an African American, just kind of fitted culturally with what he was going for. That said, it's still tough to talk about, because so much of what Cobb did and wrote was influential and important and excellent. And you have to deal with this elephant sitting right there in the middle of the room. And you can only kind of mitigate it to some degree by saying, well, the guy was born in the immediate post-Reconstruction South, and his attitude about the whole thing is not unusual. But it's still, I think, really kind of hobbles him even to this day, as far as people knowing who he was and what he wrote.
Okay. What other stories do you think of that are worth mentioning by Cobb?
I would recommend, if you're into Fishhead, that you read The Belled Buzzard. It's a short story if you haven't. I think it's in the same book that Fishhead appears in as a short story of republishing. The Escape of Mr. Trim, maybe.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of.
I think it appears in that. That's a. I'm sure he heard that folktale somewhere. I'm not sure, and just added to it. That would be my recommendation.
There were a few I came across that are not in the book that I came across online. It was like Darkness, the story about a man who refused to live in darkness at all, which I really liked. And Snake Doctor, about a man who plots revenge against a man who's spending too much time with his wife.
You know, and I would almost recommend more of his nonfiction, particularly his reporting from the First World War. He wrote unflinchingly about what he saw, and I think that may have fed into his desire to almost kind of cope with what he saw on the battlefield in his grim stories. You know, he writes about the broken bodies, the destroyed buildings, and that I think that real world horror fed into the fictional horrors that he created. So I would almost steer people towards that. Plus, I almost hate to say this, but I kind of prefer his nonfiction to his fiction. As good as I think Fishhead is, I think his nonfiction is even better. And certainly with regard to the war, it really dovetailed quite nicely into how he coped with it through his actual fiction. That's my personal opinion, though. So who's to say?
What about his guide books?
His guidebooks are interesting, but going off what Todd said, Exit Laughing, which is kind of his autobiography, is a great read for any person studying American history, United States history from, 1870s, 1850s even, because he talks about his genealogy. Both him and Lovecraft they talk genealogy a lot. They're really into that whole thing. And I find that interesting as a person who works in archives and libraries, their infatuation with bloodlines. But Exit Laughing is a pretty good read because it really tells his story. He talks about the Goebel assassination and how he at one time is considered to be a suspect and questioned. And Todd did this. You can go to Frankfurt and literally see where Cobb was standing pretty much. And he talks about his time overseas in the war. And I would recommend Exit Laughing to anyone.
I'll tell you, though, I think that his guidebooks, they're the ones I think that are probably in the greatest danger of coming off a bit dated. If only because, he, as humorous as he intended them to be, they are also kind of observational. And so there is going to be, they're almost better read as curiosities than anything else. I mean, the guy knows his way around a turn of phrase. I'll say that for him in those guidebooks. And when he, the Kentucky one, he gets into it is a bit sentimental. I mean, let's face it. If he ever writes about Kentucky, it gets sentimental. I mean, in fact, I think he wrote something saying that if you don't tear up when you hear My Old Kentucky Home, you're not a Kentuckian. And I hate to admit it, he's right. He's absolutely right.
I should note that guide was spelled Guied.
Right.
What about his own recipe book?
For the bourbon drinker.
Yeah.
It's actually a great historical piece when looking at types of bourbons, I think. Even from the cover, where it's like the cover that I see, one of them, I think it's on the cover, there's like a picture of the bar with like 12 different Kentucky bourbons, but he missed some too. So
maybe planned a sequel or something. So is there anything else you'd like to say about Irvin S. Cobb as you wrap up? Is there anything being from Paducah that y'all picked up on that other people outside of the area would not?
Huh. It's really quite remarkable. When I did that documentary, I was really surprised at the connections I was able to draw between this, ugly, gawky looking kid from Paducah to things that, are just kind of part of the pop culture landscape. I mean, in fact, still to this day, my favorite part of that documentary is talking to Bobby Wrinkle and Nathan and Matt Yeager, and drawing the line between Irvin Cobb and Janet Leigh not being able to take showers after 1962, and drawing that line straight through, H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Bloch and Alfred Hitchcock. And that book being such a big pop culture impact, or cultural impact, really, and it largely coming out of a recommendation that Lovecraft made to Robert Bloch. That blows me away, absolutely. The idea that Irvin Cobb was in the mid 1930s was the Stephen King in terms of book sales and money of his generation. I mean, bigger than writers, the important writers like Faulkner and Hemingway and Fitzgerald. And today he has just disappeared into obscurity. And I kind of agree with some of the people that I talked to about why that was. That he just, there was something that on some level was kind of facile about some of the writing that he did, where it just seemed like it didn't matter if he had written it or not. It was not something that was earth-shattering or insightful necessarily, but it was just sitting down and telling a good story, which, don't get me wrong, I'm a very big believer in that. I think that if you want to say something, you should be able to hold your audience, because if you don't, they're not going to really get to what you have to say. But I think sometimes Cobb told stories just to tell the stories. There wasn't anything necessarily impactful in some of these works. And now, on the other hand, he writes the Judge Priest stories that provide an incredible snapshot of the race relations at the time, the social inequities of the time, the politics, the social politics, the sexual politics. Then there's grim stories in Fishhead, which have this rather remarkable impact in the literature of American horror. It still doesn't seem quite fair that he is as overlooked as he is.
Anything you want to add, Nathan?
I agree with Todd, and someone mentioned regionalism, and that's what drew me to Cobb. And some of the language can be harsh now, to be honest. But the regional descriptions in Fishhead, for example, of describing the lake and the cypress trees and the canoes, the very specific dugout canoe that is to that area, and his play on folk tales is drawing for the time period. And I encourage people to at least delve into some of these short stories if you're into them, if you're into that type of horror. That there's a couple you can read there that you might find interesting, and maybe it will inspire you to research Western Kentucky and West Tennessee folklore some more.
Okay, we'll wrap up with one more. We usually do like a Lovecraftian word, and for this one, I decided to do a Cobbian word, and this one's going to be for vampire. Y'all can answer in as well. What do you think Cobb meant when he used the word vampire in Mr. Lobo's apoplexy? Yeah, can't say the word.
That's a good question.
I haven't read it, so I can't really say anything.
I would need more context.
I'll just, I'll defer to the experts here.
I kind of want to lean toward, someone who just basically using that word almost interchangeably with like a tick or a parasite.
No, it's a.
I don't know.
Let me abbreviate the word for you as a word we may be more familiar with. Vamp.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, he used it as a description for the actress in the movie that who died, after it was completed. And so it was like, she was called a vampire throughout the entire thing. And when you're a little bit kind of thrown off by actors using the modern sense of it, as being like, the blood
But he's-
sucking undead.
He means more like a Theta Bara kind.
Yes.
Hmm.
That
doesn't surprise me.
like a seductress type of thing. Anyway.
Well, simply to say seductress, well, that wouldn't be proper now, would it?
Yeah.
You have to say it very proper, and then you should be fine. You can talk about it in front of your Aunt Millicent and Paula.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure they would get along with that. Dave and Richard and the rest, I see the stars are no longer right. We must cease all discussion until they align again next month. 30 plus minutes of H.P. Lovecraft is sponsored by Lobel's Masterwork Films, The She-Devil. See Vanda Monta in her last film before the producers burn it. This podcast was created in association with LovecraftPod.com and Logan Speculative Fiction Group with the help of the Logan County Public Library and the Great Old Ones. Special thanks to Katie Tyson for being the power behind the throne, and uber thanks for Jessica for the buttons that she made. These are nice buttons, aren't they? Yes. And Joshua Duke for the hate beak. Until we meet again, may you avoid the wrath of Princess Cthulhu's fish heads.